to the afternoon session of the Field Investigation of the Commission on Water Resource Management for today. So we finished the morning portion visiting Nauha, Kohanahiki, and we just finished up at the park and the harbor. And now we're into the afternoon sessions for briefings. So we're going to have two. First, the National Park. Tammy Deshane's going to go over and hand the mic to her in a second. And then following that will be, I believe, Delwyn Oki from the USGS to give us information. Oh, okay, sorry. I'll consider that part of the National Park package.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so take it away, Tammy.
Thank you. Aloha. It was so nice seeing you out at our park. Thank you. Aloha, my name is Tammy Deshane, and I'm the superintendent of Kaloko Honoköhau National Historical Park. I would like to share with you a few things today. One is, what is the National Park Service mandate? Next, a little bit about the establishment of Kaloko Honoköhau, the purpose of Kaloko Honoköhau, and the park resources. What is the National Park Service? The National Park Service is a federal agency, part of the Department of Interior. There are 401 National Park Service units. Some examples include Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, Everglades, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Hawaii volcanoes, Haleakala. While these parks are very different and diverse, we all must manage for the same purpose. The Federal Organic Act of 1916 established the National Park Service to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. This means the protection of land and water resources. What this means is we must manage proactively to prevent harm to public trust resources, not react once we see impacts. A little bit about the establishment of the park. The cover is of the Spirit Report. The artwork is by Herb Kane. As you heard from Fred Cachola today, the park was established by very unique means. In the late 1960s, many Native Hawaiians in the Kona area were concerned about the potential impacts to this very special place due to proposed development. They took their concerns to Representative Patsy Mink, and in 1972, she established the Kaloko Honoköhau Study Advisory Commission. This commission was comprised of very prominent Native Hawaiians, such as Fred Cachola, Filippo Springer, David Roy, and Colonel Chung. These commissioners were tasked with the duty of trying to establish whether it was feasible or desirable for Kaloko Honoköhau area to become a National Park Service unit. They decided it was, and in their document, the Spirit Report, they documented the vision for the management of this proposed park. In this document, they dictated that Native Hawaiians carefully managed water resources, and going forward, the National Park Service should as well. Each park has its own unique enabling legislation. Again, while we all must manage to prevent impairment and prevent impacts to public trust resources, every park has a unique purpose. Kaloko Honoköhau's is to provide a center for the preservation, interpretation, and perpetuation of traditional Native Hawaiian activities and culture. Why VI? In addition to the enabling legislation I just shared, it goes on to say the Secretary of the Interior shall consult with and may enter into agreements with other governmental entities and private landowners to establish adequate controls on the air and water quality and the scenic and aesthetic values of the areas surrounding land and water areas. This means that they found it so important to call out the explicit need to manage for water resources and the need for the National Park Service, the federal government, to work with governmental entities to provide management of water, just as was called for in the Spirit Report. The enabling legislation further goes on to say that in consulting with and entering into such agreements, the Secretary shall, to the maximum extent feasible, utilize the traditional native Hawaiian ahupua'a concept of land and water management. What this means is ensuring for the flow of water, mauka to makai, and preserving both land and water resources. A little bit about park resources. Many of you were able to join us today on the site visit. The park is located south of the airport, north of Kailua town. It is 596 marine acres, 564 land acres, and comprises portions of 4 ahupua'a. The park is a tremendous cultural landscape in the midst of an urban environment where Native Hawaiians can go to rejuvenate their culture and their spirit. Some cultural resources that the park preserves and protects are 2 fish ponds. You saw Kaloko. We unfortunately did not make it to Aimakapa, but we stand by and would be very happy to give you a tour anytime you would like. A fish trap, which you saw today, Aiopio, when we were sitting in the halau. Heiau, which you could see from the point. House sites, raised planters, petroglyphs, and burial sites. Natural resources that the park is mandated to preserve and protect for future generations includes coastal, terrestrial, and marine habitats, wetlands, which you heard about, ancholine pool habitat, which you saw, and endemic and indigenous biota, 16 threatened, endangered, and candidate species. Again, you were able to see ancholine pools, which provides habitat for orange-black damselfly and opaiula. Intertidal zones, which helps maintain organisms such as sea urchins, kauri, sea cucumbers, and various species of limu. And marine waters, which comprises amazing coral reefs and plentiful fish species. The fish ponds again, Kaloko and Aimakapa, which provide habitat for the coot and the stilt. So I shared with you that is the National Park Service's mission to preserve resources into the future and to proactively manage to prevent harm to public resources. I've also shared that water was and is essential to Kaloko, Honoköhau. So what has the National Park Service done to make sure that we are fulfilling our responsibility to the kapuna? The National Park Service has funded water science since 1992. We have been talking story with various groups for over 6 years. We participate in groundwater working groups, the Water Professionals Group, and Kona Water Roundtable, and we participate in public processes like permits, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements. So in summary, the National Park Service is mandated to proactively manage to prevent harm to public trust resources, and water is a public trust resource. With that, I will pass the presentation off to Peter Fahmy, who will talk about Hawaii's Public Trust Doctrine.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just make some preparatory remarks while we get this up. Okay. Aloha, Commissioners. My name is Peter Fahmy, and I'm here today to help answer a very important question. Why did the National Park Service file a petition to designate a water management area? I believe that it would be very valuable for you to understand the process and the reasoning that the National Park Service went through when it decided to respectfully request that you use your constitutionally mandated authority to begin to manage the use of groundwater in this unique area of the Big Island. In order to explain the process and the rationale that led the National Park Service to file a petition, I will cover the following topics. First, I'll talk about the management policies of the National Park Service. I'll talk about your state constitution, the case law of your courts, the state statutes, state water plan, and the Commission's regulations and other documents. Next slide, please. As Tammy pointed out, park contains significant public trust resources. Federal law requires that the National Park Service protect those resources, and the management policies of the National Park Service require that, in the first instance, that protection of those resources be obtained through legal authorities. And I think I want to make it clear that the way it works with water resources in the states, Congress and the courts have clearly spoken that states have primacy in the allocation and management of water resources. So federal agencies seek to use those frameworks, those legal regimes of the states, to obtain water rights and to protect the resources that they're charged to protect. The National Park Service works with states' water officials throughout the country in order to, and we've been very successful in doing that, but the first step is for the National Park Service to understand what the state law provides for, so we can understand how we can utilize the laws of this state to protect those resources. Next slide, please. So, in looking at how we could obtain protection for these public trust resources at the park, our starting point was to look at your Constitution, your fundamental legal document. And when we looked at the Constitution, let's go to the next slide, we quickly recognized that there is a very important portion of the Constitution that speaks to what's called the Public Trust Doctrine. This is Article 11, Section 1 of that Constitution. It makes it clear what the parameters of the Public Trust Doctrine is. And in reviewing the law, the case law of your courts, it became apparent to us that through the decisions of the Hawai'i Supreme Court, that the Public Trust Doctrine is a fundamental element of the constitutional law of the state of Hawaii. And that this provision has been interpreted as creating a duty on the part of the state and its political subdivisions, its counties, to protect and preserve those public trust resources. Let's go to the next slide. This is another section of the Hawaii Constitution, Section 7. I think what's significant here is it talks about an obligation, an affirmative obligation of the state to protect, to control, to regulate. And I think it's important that it talks about regulate because it's talking about action on the part of the state. This portion of the Constitution, Section 7, also required the creation of a water resource agency that was charged to protect the ground and surface waters of the state, the watersheds, the natural stream environments. Of course, this section is what gave rise to the creation of the Commission on Water Resource Management. Next slide, please. So, in addition to looking at your state constitution, your state statutes, the case law of your courts, the Park Service, when it looks throughout the country, when it looks at the legal regimes, looks at what sort of regulations, what sort of plans states have with regards to allocating and managing resources. So when we were trying to figure out what the goal of the Public Trust Doctrine was with regards to protection of these public trust resources, we naturally tried to determine, well, what are these public trust resources? And one of the documents we looked at was the Water Resource Protection Plan, the most recent one from 2008. This list of public trust purposes is taken from that document. So it's very clear to the National Park Service that the Public Trust Doctrine does at least speak to the maintenance of environments, of natural environments, of the waters of the state in a natural condition. So let's go to the next slide, and let's talk about the scope of that State Water Resources Trust, which is what the Supreme Court has labeled it as. And again, we looked at the 2008 Water Resource Protection Plan. And in that document, and also in the decisions of the Hawai'i Supreme Court, it's clear that the Public Trust Doctrine doesn't just apply to surface waters. It applies to groundwater as well. So let's go to the next slide, please. So in continuing our investigation, our analysis of state law, we came across an element of the Public Trust Doctrine that's been called the precautionary principle. And the Hawai'i Supreme Court, in its decisions, has described it as an essential element of the Public Trust Doctrine. So in trying to understand, let's go to the next slide, what the precautionary principle is, we delved into a little more into the Public Trust Doctrine and what the purpose of that doctrine is. And it's clear from looking at the cases that have spoken on this from the court that it's a preventive doctrine. It's one that says, let's attempt to prevent harm to these resources. It's not a doctrine that's remedial in nature that says, well, let's develop, and if something goes wrong, we'll fix it later, okay? And the precautionary principle, therefore, is an inherent attribute of the doctrine because it talks about trying to take some sort of action that would prevent harm to those resources when the state endeavors to allocate those resources, to develop those resources. So I think what's central to the precautionary principle is that it asks not how much harm is allowable, but rather how little harm is possible. I think that's an important distinction. So let's go to the next slide. In endorsing the Public Trust Doctrine, the precautionary principle, the Hawai'i Supreme Court made it clear that the guardians of the public trust are not required to wait until there's actual harm to public trust resources before taking action, because that would only allow for reactive measures, not preventive measures. So they said you don't need to have absolute certainty, okay, as to the threat, okay? You can look to the future. You can anticipate what threats might occur and what their effects on public trust resources are, and you can take measures to prevent that harm. So let's go to the next slide. So this is from the Commission's decision in what's known as the Waiho'ole matter from 1997, where the Commission, in talking about the precautionary principle, talked about that in instances where you don't have conclusive scientific evidence, where it's preliminary, you don't have all the information you perhaps would wish for, that you can still take prudent measures to protect public trust resources. Let's go to the next slide. So, in trying to understand what those measures might encompass, again, we looked at the Water Resource Protection Plan in 2008. And among these precautionary measures are actions that would increase the resilience, the health, the integrity of a whole system. That's straight from the plan. So when the Park Service was looking at this document, interpreting it, for us, the whole system is the park. It's the resources there. It's the ecosystem. It's the It's what supports those cultural and natural resources. It's the groundwater. Let's go to the next slide. And among those precautionary measures, in reviewing the state case law again, we discovered that one of the measures that had been suggested by the Hawai'i Supreme Court in the Waiho'oli matter was the establishment of margins, what they termed margins of safety, to protect these public trust purposes. Let's go to the next slide. In fact, on remand from the first Waiho'oli decision, when the Commission was considering what its next steps should be, this idea of adopting margins of safety was embraced by the chairperson at that time of the Commission, who understood, I think, the value of having margins of safety to accomplish the public trust duties of the Commission and to essentially advance the precautionary principle. So let's go to the next slide. So the question through this analysis, at this point in our analysis, came to, well, how can we establish, using state law that I've talked about here, how can we establish these margins of safety to protect public trust resources at Kaloko, Honoköhau National Historical Park? And that's a picture of Waiho'oli Stream there. That's, as you perhaps all know, there was a surface water case. Here we're dealing with groundwater, but we thought, you know, maybe there's a way to obtain margins of safety, not only for surface water, but for groundwater as well. So let's go to the next slide. So we looked at the state water code, and we asked ourselves, how could public trust resources be protected outside of a water management area? What are the options that are available to the National Park Service? And in looking at your state water code, we found that for surface water systems, you have to get a stream diversion works permit, okay, for surface water outside of water management areas. And among the criteria is that the quantity and quality of stream water and stream ecology must not be adversely affected. So there was clearly a way in the surface water context outside of a water management area where these public trust resources could be considered and protected. Let's go to the next slide. So then we considered, well, is this possible for groundwater outside a water management area? And what we found in our analysis is that there was no protection for public trust resources outside of a water management area for those public trust resources that are dependent on groundwater. Because the definition of sustainable yield does not provide for protection of public trust resources. What it provides, and this is a quote from the definition, means the maximum rate at which water may be withdrawn from a water source without impairing the utility or quality of the water source. Utility or quality. Well, in reviewing the law, your state law, we came to the conclusion that what was being addressed here was the quality for consumptive purposes, not for purposes necessarily of protecting all the public trust uses. And in looking further at the state water code and the regulations for the issuance of well construction and pump installation permits, we saw that it did not involve any sort of analysis of the effects on all of the public trust uses of water. So let's go to the next slide. So the conclusion we reached after this analysis of your state water code was that for areas such as this Ohio Gulch, I believe it is, in Haleakala, that if someone would wish to divert water from this area, which is outside of a water management area, that there was a mechanism to protect those public trust resources in a surface water context. But for these alkaline pools here on the right, that there was no such mechanism under your state water code outside of a water management area. Let's go to the next slide. So that left us to look at how could we get a water management area if that was the only way that we could obtain the protection for the public trust resources that we, as the National Park Service, are charged to protect. And looking at the state water code, we saw that where resources may be threatened, and again, this is an aspect, if you will, of the precautionary principle. It doesn't require that they in fact be threatened, okay, but may be threatened from prospective groundwater withdrawals in the future, proposed withdrawals, that you could get the designation of a water management area. And the Park Service, as Tammy has mentioned, has undertaken scientific investigations, and the Park Service, management of the National Park Service reasonably determined that there was a reasonable probability that future groundwater withdrawals may threaten those public trust resources within the park. So on that basis, the Park Service believed, let's go to the next slide, that the law of the state of Hawaii provided a sufficient legal basis to protect the public trust resources, as Congress had intended. It was intended to look at state law first. Can state law provide the basis to protect these resources? And if so, how can you use state law to do so? And we concluded that the only way we could obtain such protection was through the designation of a water management area. That analysis led to the filing of the petition. And the National Park Service believes that there is sufficient scientific evidence to support the designation of a water management area to protect those public trust resources. And that's what we did in submitting our petition to the Commission, is respectfully request that you use your authority under state law to protect the public trust resources that the Park Service as a federal agency has asked you in furtherance of your duties under the Constitution to undertake.